This morning's scripture reading is from the ESV, Matthew 5, verses 33 to 48. Oaths. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Retaliation. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. And love your enemies. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
So as we're going through this passage here now, we're taking a little bit of a bigger chunk this morning. This is the Sermon on the Mount, and we're finally getting through the first chapter of that, chapter 5. The Sermon on the Mount goes from chapter 5 through to chapter 7, the first of the Discourses of Jesus in the book of Matthew. And you'll remember that about a month ago, we were still on this same chapter, and we were looking at the purpose and the fulfillment of the law. That's one of the things that Jesus has been talking about here, the main thing he's been confronting. And the fulfillment and the purpose of the law is, of course, Jesus Christ. And one of the things that Jesus said was that if we want to see the kingdom of heaven, he said our righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. If we want to make it to heaven, we have to have a righteousness that would exceed the scribes and the Pharisees. And if you don't know who those guys are, you can think of them as being like the religious leaders of the day. And so that is quite a lot, isn't it? I mean, if you want to make it to heaven, you have to have a righteousness, a goodness before God that is better than the people who felt that they had perfected righteousness. That's quite a standard. Now, how high of a standard is that, and how do we interpret that? Well, one of the ways we've traditionally viewed this is to say that what Jesus was getting at was that it was a standard that we could never reach on our own. That we would never have a righteousness that would earn our way into his eternal kingdom. It would only be through Jesus giving us his righteousness that we would get there. And that's true. And that is the message of the gospel, as a matter of fact. And it is only by Jesus' righteousness, freely given to us by his grace, that we are saved. It is all Jesus. But this passage, I think, was saying even more than that. The scribes and the Pharisees, now they had a type of righteousness, but it wasn't a good type, we might say. It was a fleshly type, not a heart type of righteousness. The outside looked good, but inside they were dead. And so Jesus confronts that over and over again in this passage, and he brings the law to a heart level. Our righteousness must exceed that kind of righteousness that was only external. So the question I think we can ask ourselves is, do we really love Jesus? Do you really love to listen to him? Do you love to follow him? Do you love to keep his commands? If you do, I think what Jesus is saying here is that you will develop a righteousness that will far surpass what the scribes and the Pharisees had. When you really love Jesus and you really understand what he has done for you, you will begin to live a moral life that will in fact be even superior to the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. Not because you have to, but because you love to. You say, when I see how much Jesus has done for me, how much he has loved me, how he sacrificed for me, how could I not give all of my life to him, to conform to him, to his standards and to his commands and his goodness? And in chapter 5, Jesus gives us 6 illustrations, actually, of what that kind of life looks like. And we have looked at 3 of them already, and today we are going to look at the next 3, and I've grouped these, as you've noticed as we read through them, into a grouping, these 3 sections. The first 3 that we looked at were anger, lust, and divorce. And so we covered those a few weeks back. We need to live lives that are free from anger, that do not lust after what is not ours, even to the extent, Jesus said, of gouging out our eyes and cutting off our hands. And a life that holds to a high view of marriage. A marriage that is fought for and nurtured and protected. And those are some of the things it means to have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And today, we will also see that this kind of righteousness needs to revolutionize the relationships that we have with one another. And that's how I'd characterize these 3 sections that we read today. There are ways in which we are called to do this. And we will see it by looking at what Jesus has to say about oaths, about retaliation, and then about loving our enemies, which if you're following along in your Bibles this morning, you will see that's exactly how it's laid out. And this is really good stuff because there should be things that characterize our relationships that make us look different than the rest of the world and the relationships that they have. We should look different. We should act differently. Jesus says that if you're going to be my disciples, if you're going to be people of my kingdom, you have to look different than the rest of the world. And we need to hear this because we often fail in this area of relationships. We need basic instruction of how to deal with other human beings. It sounds basic, but yet it is a struggle. What should characterize our relationships with one another? How do you look on and interact with your brothers and sisters and even your neighbors? Jesus has all of these things in view to help us this morning. And so we'll have these 3 areas, and then we will look at why we are able to do this. So what does Jesus have to say about relationships through the ideas of oaths, through retaliation, and loving our enemies? So first of all, this idea of oaths. And I put this under a category of speaking with truth and integrity. Because Jesus says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So the passage starts off by Jesus saying that there is a saying that people should not lie and should not take certain kinds of oaths. But Jesus says, well, you shouldn't take oaths at all. And so we read that and think, but doesn't the rest of Scripture talk about taking oaths to the Lord? And didn't God himself make oaths? And so how do we reconcile these 2 things? Deuteronomy chapter 10 tells us that we are to fear the Lord, to serve him, to cleave to him, and to swear by his name. Paul himself swears by God all of the time. God himself swears that he will never send another universal flood, that he will send us Jesus, and that he will raise him from the dead. So what's going on here? Is this contradictory? And some Christians have used this passage to never take oaths at all, like in a court or oaths of allegiance. They said it's wrong for them to do so. But Jesus, once again, he's referring to a very specific situation, thing that was going on at the time. The Jewish leaders and the rabbis, they had legalized oaths to this incredible detail. If you want to read all about them, you can open up the Mishnah and you can see all about them and read about them there. I mean, there was a certain kind of oath for absolutely every situation. It was so detailed. And of course, as soon as you start legalizing something, you also find ways of getting around the thing that you legalize. It's kind of what we do. So as soon as there's a rule, you find ways of being able to legally break that rule, and that's what happened to oaths. You know, it was almost like, well, you'd make an oath, but if your fingers were crossed, it didn't really mean anything. You know, it's that kind of thing, but to a greater extent even. There was an oath for everything, and there were also rules about times when an oath didn't need to be followed through with. It had gotten really bizarre. And this had not helped the cause of truthfulness, but it actually made it worse, because the idea is that we should be able to speak truthfully to each other. Jesus says don't do that. He says that a disciple of his is going to be the kind of person who lets their yes be yes and their no be no. We want to know in a community like this that what we say to one another is truthful and that we will follow through on the things that we say, and that creates kingdom community. You don't need an oath to tell the truth. It should be the standard that is among us. You know, I think one of the ways this becomes an issue for many people is living consistently in every situation. Sometimes we have struggled to do that. I think a lot of people live with a duplicity. You know, they're one person here and they're another person there. You know, have you ever thought about that, of how you live consistently in the various places you find yourself? Are you consistent with who you are? Are you the same at home as you are when you're at church? That would be truthfulness if you are. Are you the same at school as you are when you're at youth group? Are you the same when you're at work as you are when you're at home? Are you the same person online as when you're in person? And that's kind of an easy one to get behind, right? Anonymous trolls can say whatever they want when they're behind a computer or a phone. That is so common, it's created a toxic environment online and in social media communities. Most of these people are not like that in person, but when you have this level of anonymity, you change. Jesus says simply, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Wherever you are, be the same, be consistent, be a person of that kind of integrity, the kind of person that people can trust, the kind of person that has a consistent truthfulness wherever you are. That creates a good community of God's people. You know, we live in a world where there's a lot of people that aren't truthful. We look for ways to get around truth, or where we use untruths in order to get our way. I read a fascinating, well-known story about Hitler and Neville Chamberlain in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. And it's a fascinating topic of why we have a hard time judging people and why so many people can get away with deceit. Why do people lie, and why do we usually believe them? That's kind of the theme of this book. It's quite interesting. And he tells about 1938 Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain. He wanted a meeting with Hitler to try and dissuade him over taking over a part of Czechoslovakia that was kind of a small German-speaking section. And thereby, he didn't want him to overtake any of Czechoslovakia, of course, because it would start World War II. So this campaign was known as Plan Z. Well, of course, when they came to him with Plan Z to tell them not to do that, to only take this small section, of course Hitler agreed. And when they started talking, Hitler told Chamberlain that he wasn't interested in overtaking all of Czechoslovakia, but only just that small German-speaking people. And then he would be satisfied, and he would do no more. Chamberlain said after that meeting, he said, I got the impression that there was a man who could be relied upon when given his word. So he, of course, believed him, and the rest of the world leaders did too, and they allowed Hitler to begin his work. Hitler took that area, but of course he didn't stop there. He continued on with much more, much more. He lied to Chamberlain and other leaders, allied leaders of all the allied nations, many times over. You know, this kind of deceit, it didn't bother him at all. He said he would lie 1,000 times over for Germany. He had no qualms about being deceitful. It was all to gain his advantage. And how often do we do the same? I mean, not with the same outcomes, of course, but with the same attitude of the heart. Not telling the whole truth or being outright deceitful in order to get the things that we want. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of lies that we can tell, and I think we can categorize the type of lies sometimes that we use. I heard Tim Keller talking about a few ways when he was speaking on integrity. One of these is like not being totally truthful when someone asks you to do something, and then you tell them why you can't do it. I don't know if you've ever done that one. Sorry, I can't come over and help. I have another commitment. You know, that type of thing. I think this one kind of gets used a lot when someone asks our help to move. That's a big one. I would love to, but I'm going to be out of town. No, you're not. Well, actually, Kale and Krista, I really was out of town when you asked me to move. You know, I did use that one, but I really was not here. You know, there's those kind of lies, things that help us get our way or get us out of things we don't want to do. Then there's lies of exaggeration as well. You know, how big was that fish really? You know, did the story that you're telling, did it really happen that way? It can help to tell a really good story when we use some exaggeration. We love to exaggerate, but then it actually often becomes, we love to exaggerate our own goodness in a story. Have you ever told a story and our own goodness becomes quite prominent, or the other person's faults become more prominent than what they really are? That can be a really tough one. Do we have lies of exaggeration that we allow? Do you ever fall prey to that? I think another big one is what we might call benevolent lies, and that's when a person actually needs to hear the truth, but no one wants to tell them. That's a tough one. Who wants to be the one? Maybe the most loving thing to do is just to not say anything or to agree with them when we know it's not true. Just affirm whatever a person says rather than something that might be hard but is the truth. When we do that, it's actually a lie. You see, there's a lot of ways we can lie, and Jesus says that it should not be so for my disciples. People of my kingdom, let their yes be yes, and let their no be no. This is one way that your righteousness will actually exceed the scribes and the Pharisees, not because we're rotely trying to do it, but because we have been transformed into a people that are truthful. So that's the first thing that Jesus says about interacting with other humans, the people who are around you. Be truthful with them. The second thing he gets at in the next session is don't retaliate against the people who wrong you. And there's a lot of interesting things here as well. He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow money from you. So here Jesus is saying that was common at the time, which was referred to a way in which vengeance and justice would be enacted. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's actually one of the oldest laws in the world, and it is often known or referred to as the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. It really is the foundation to all modern day justice. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The punishment must fit the crime. That's what we say, and that's where we get that from. In ancient times, a feud between tribes could really escalate very quickly. And so this law was badly needed because things just kept progressing and progressing. As Ken Hugh mentions in his commentary, he says trespassing could be met with a beating, which would be met with a homicide, which would be met by genocide. It just gets worse and worse. And so the eye for an eye law was actually a thing of mercy that helped to quell that problem. But Jesus takes it a whole lot further. He says, do not resist or retaliate at all. And then he gives 4 illustrations of what this looks like. And what we need to understand here is that I think we need to understand that Jesus is not teaching just absolute non-resistance. This isn't a passage about pacifism, because why do we want to retaliate at all is what we have to look at. Jesus is getting at the heart. It all comes down to justice. We retaliate. We want to see justice served when an injustice has happened to us or someone we love. That's where retaliation comes in. We feel we've been wronged. We feel that someone close to us has been wronged. We want to retaliate. We want to mete out the justice. We know what should be done to that person. This is what Jesus is getting at. We often think, I don't deserve what happened to me, or my kids don't deserve what happened to them, or whoever it was. And so we want to get back. We want to make them pay. They hurt us, or someone we love, and we're going to hurt them. Or at the least, maybe we'll just rejoice when something bad happens to them. I don't know if that's ever happened. You've seen that. There's someone that you have a hard time with. They go through a difficulty, and we almost rejoice that they're going through that. This is the kind of retaliation that Jesus is speaking about. Why do we do this? Because we don't trust God's justice. Ultimately, we do this because we don't believe that God is the God of justice who will perfectly execute his justice amongst all of us. We think we're in control of the justice. We know the right thing to do, and we're going to retaliate in order to put things in our own hands. They're going to pay. Now, we talked a lot about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about forgiveness, so I won't rehash that whole idea again here this morning, but the general gist is that for forgiveness to happen, someone must pay. For us to feel like justice has been served, we must make someone pay. And Jesus says, not so in my kingdom, not for my people. Don't retaliate. Don't take it into your own hands. It's not up to you to get back at them. In fact, I'm going to teach you that you are to love that person rather than retaliating against them. And that's going to be coming up next. But for now, Jesus gives 4 illustrations of what that retaliation is. First of all, the first illustration, he says, when you're insulted. And this is the slap on the cheek thing. A backhanded slap on the cheek was done as an insult. You know, it wasn't really done to injure. It was like an ultimate insult. This wasn't like necessarily a hard slap where the guy was trying to like punch you out necessarily. It's not like the new sport that Dana White made up called power slap. I don't know if you've seen this. It's insane. You get to stand there and the person gets to hit you as hard as they want, and they get $2,000. That's a lot to pay for your brain, I would say. But that's what it is. But this is not like that. This is not that kind of a slap. They shake and they hug it out after. But this is an insult. This is very different. And what do you do when you get insulted, when you feel like someone has insulted you? You don't give it back. You don't give it back because you are secure in Jesus. You don't have to retaliate. You don't have to have that knee-jerk reaction to do something in return. That doesn't mean that you don't defend yourself or your position. You don't just sit there like a sitting duck. But it simply means that you don't look for a way to do the same thing back. You don't have to give back to them in the way that you feel you were done wrong. To retaliate usually with another insult. Disciples don't do that, Jesus says. The second illustration, it's like when somebody wants what's yours. And this is when someone sues you, he says, and takes your tunic. We don't usually wear tunics. But he says you give him your cloak as well. So for Ness guys, this means if he takes your white undershirt, you throw in your flannel shirt as well. It would be a way of saying this. Ladies, you can take it to mean whatever that means for your wardrobe. But what Jesus is saying here is that there are things that are rightfully yours. But don't hold on too tightly to them, Jesus says. Don't hold on too tightly to these things. If someone else feels that they have a claim for them, just give it to them rather than going to court. You don't need to be the kind of people who are always fighting for your perceived rights. That can be a really hard thing for us to do. But Jesus says, not so in my kingdom. The third thing is when someone wants a favor, this illustration. When someone forces you to go 1 mile with them, go the extra mile. And this was likely referring to, you may have heard this, of a Roman soldier who would often command a civilian to do something like carry something for someone a certain distance. Be glad to do it. Just do it and go even further if you can. If a Roman soldier tells you that, don't complain about it, but go the extra distance. I mean, who would do that other than a disciple of Jesus? Most people, of course, they're going to just do the absolute minimum for fear of reprisal. But Jesus says for my disciples, be willing to do it, even gladly, and even go the extra mile for that person. It's an incredible way of looking at relationships differently. The fourth is when someone's in need, and Jesus gives a teaching here that tells us not to retaliate, is that we are to give to those who beg from you. Give to those who beg from you, and borrow to those who would ask for it. Now, this is a tough one. This is a tough one because, you know, we're used to people being around us asking for money and things like that. Most major intersections in our city right now, this happens when you pull up to a light at an intersection. No one really walks around downtown anymore doing this because there's not as many people, so it wouldn't be as profitable, and so they have moved to traffic intersections. And are we to give to every person that does this? Is this what Jesus is saying? Every time someone asks, Do we give in that way? And sometimes it can be awkward, right? We sometimes pull into that second lane so they can't come up to our window. This is a complicated situation because sometimes we know the money is going to places that maybe it shouldn't go. And I don't think necessarily that Jesus is condoning just a blind faith in all people who beg, even when our giving might make their problem worse. We do want to be wise, but sometimes I think we have a tight-fisted attitude. Like, I have what's mine, I deserve it. This person doesn't deserve what I have. But Jesus says that should not be so among my disciples. That tight-fisted attitude. Don't be a penny pincher. And don't refuse to give to others when you have the ability to do so. Jesus' disciples are called to be generous people. The principle here is, are you willing to give when you will get nothing in return? It can be easy to give when we know something is coming back, but what about when nothing will happen? When you won't receive? You may not hear from that person again ever. They may not come back to thank you. Are we willing to give? We're going to look at that more closely because Jesus confronts that very specifically at the beginning of the next chapter 6. But are you willing to give to the person who is even your enemy? Because now Jesus is taking it even to that level. It's one thing for our friends and the people that we like, but what about our enemies? Luke says so in Luke chapter 6, as he records Jesus' words in Luke 6:35, we are told to love our enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. This is that kind of generous spirit, that generous attitude that goes even beyond the people in our circles and our zones to move beyond those who we have difficult time loving. All of these illustrations are to say that generosity is to be a key character trait if we call ourselves followers of Jesus. Even generosity towards people we may consider our enemies. What might that look like in your life? So is the first, the third thing that Jesus mentioned in relating to other human beings, even those who are difficult, is to love your enemies and to treat all people with equity. It's 43 to 48. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brother, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus gives the radical reach of love. To what extent are we really called to love others? Now, the religious leaders had made a big mistake, and Jesus points it out here. It's a glaring mistake. You see it right there at the beginning. To love your neighbor and to hate your enemy. Like, was that actually a thing? It had become a thing somehow, but where had they got this from? It's found nowhere in the Old Testament, of course. Only to love your neighbor. That is a major theme. So the question became then, if we're called to love our neighbor, we see that clearly, they would say, in the Old Testament, but who is our neighbor? That's where things got really divided. Okay, love your neighbor, but who are we really being called to love here? If we're to love our neighbors, who are they? Because we don't want to waste our time loving people that we don't need to love. That was the question that got asked. Well, the rabbis had narrowed the identity of a neighbor down to about as narrow of a path as you could go. It was only fellow Jews, only those who were like them. There was no way that Jesus' disciples were going to follow that path or that teaching. And so Jesus confronts it head on here. And when he gives the parable of the Good Samaritan, where a Jewish expert in the law asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus goes on then to tell them about a man who is beat up and he's robbed and he's left for dead. And while he is laying there, two Jewish leaders, a priest and a Levi, walk by, and they walk by him on the path, and they actually move to the other side. But a Samaritan, he goes to help him in an extravagant way. I mean, as far as the Jewish people were concerned here, in this context and culture, there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. They hated the Samaritans. And so when Jesus gave this parable about a Samaritan who was the hero of the story, they must have been livid. You can understand why they wanted to crucify Jesus and to get him on something, because he kept telling them stories like this. But Jesus says that's what a neighbor does, and those are who our neighbors are. How do you love those around you, especially the ones that you don't want to love? How do we treat them? How do we talk about them? How do we come alongside them and help them and even be generous with them? These are the things that Jesus has been saying. C.S. Lewis writes about this in Mere Christianity, and I think he gives a good practical advice. He says, the rule for all of us is perfectly simple. Do not waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you do. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love them.